Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is William Davis. I'm president of the group, Detroit Active Retired Employee Association. We're going to be hearing from our keynote speaker, Dr. Peter Hammer, who has degrees in economics and law, who's a fantastic individual and has a great deal of knowledge.
We went on to just a brief history of DAREA. DAREA grew out of many active as well as retired employees attending the bankruptcy throughout the entire process. And many of us saw that it was not going in the direction that we felt it should be going in. In particular, we were offered to vote on whether or not, we should have our pensions slashed. And we felt that it was very clear that it's being set up. So it would make sure that they get a yes vote, which would disenfranchise those people who happen to vote no. And there was quite a bit of difference in that class. The people that would vote no would have the impact of the annuities being drastically cut. And so a part of what happened even before we established DAREA is that we started a campaign to fight for no. And we attended all of the hearings and meetings throughout the city to try to get the word out. You had DAREA being included in it. You had the pension board using their resources to get information out. So it was an uphill battle. But we knew early on that it would be a battle and that we would have to stand strong in our position against this. Because as we saw along the way, early on, we had the unions that did stand, the unions that said they were going to fight against them taking our health care, which was worth $4.1 billion. We recognized that if they had just gotten the health care, they probably would have been happy. So, and as it went on, they saw that, well, we can cut the pensions and we can also ask to fall back on funds. And these were unprecedented areas. So, DAREA grew out of that. We never stopped. And so now we are in the process of an appeal. And so we're asking for your support, and we want to make you provide you with as much information as possible. So as we struggle along this process, that we will have your support. Thank you.
Well, we are still fighting. We will continue to fight. We are also fighting what's going on with the Great Lakes Authority. We are fighting the theft of Detroit Water and Sewage Department. And to speak briefly on our petition drive as relates to that, we have one of our communications co-chairs.
We are conducting a legal petition to put a referendum on the ballot in the city of Detroit that says either you approve the contract with the Great Lakes Water Authority, which basically gives away the entire Detroit Water and Sewage Department to them. It's a lease, it's not a lease, it's a sale of personal property and all revenue, and they have the option to sell the real property, which is the infrastructure. So this is a disastrous attack on the city of Detroit, on the people of the city. Now, however, when they signed the contract with the Great Lakes Water Authority, they forgot to read Public Act 233 of 1955, which they said the contract is based on. And Public Act 233 of 1955 says specifically that members of the municipality contracting with a water authority have the right to be notified by public notice and to be notified of their right to a referendum on the ballot in the city that's affected, which is Detroit. So, and that we need at least 15,000 petition signatures to be turned into the city clerk. So this is something legal. This is something that can block the contract, that can save the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. We're calling it Our Water, Our Vote. And these are some of the petitions. We have the petitions already that have been going around. They should be available up here. We also have flyers and instructions for circulating. And we're asking as many people as possible to get involved in this, but we're going to battle for our water department because that's our largest asset.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Wanda Olubala. My mother is Yvonne Jones. And she asked me to come out and share with you all a poem I wrote many years ago in an effort to be an encouragement to this fight that is ongoing. It's called We the Karn. Because Detroit, you know, she's from Detroit. We the Karn. And we still here, and we still here, and we still here, still here. Betray us, enslave us, test our bodies, change our minds, exploit our labor, molest our children, hang our men, torch our women, and we still here, and we still here, and we still here, still here. Sell us, whore us, betray us, deny us, kill our humanity, rewrite our destiny, reconfigure our purpose, and we still here, and we still here, and we still here, still here. Lie about our beauty, repackage our rhythm, bottle our essence, steal our profit, destroy our communities, and we still here, and we still here, and we still here, still here. Choke out our laughter, muffle our song, demystify our dance, burn our buildings, lie. And we still here, and we still here, and we still here, still here. Force guns into our hands, pipes into our mouths, IUDs into our vaginas, tasers into our penises, and we still here, and we still here, and we still here, still here. Kill away our children, strike tears from their eyes, dismiss their cries, disbelieve their stories, and they still tell, and they still tell, and they still tell. Lie about our bodies, cover up our wounds, deny us our reparations, claim our history as your own, and we still here, 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 still here.
And we are here, and we will continue to fight, because we fight because we're right. That's right. Right now, I have the extreme honor and privilege to introduce Peter Hammond.
I first just want to thank you for inviting me, and thank that wonderful spoken word presentation. That's just really inspiring and getting me in the mood to be thinking about why we're here. I teach at Wayne State Law, but the more important thing I do is direct a civil rights center in the name of a very great man. And I always like to sort of start these things giving homage to Judge Damon J. Keith, who really is an amazing inspiration to me and the people in the law school, but I think to people all over the city of Detroit and all over this country and this world. And the work that we try to do at the Keith Center really is our effort to live up to the life and legacy and the teaching and the values of Damon J. Keith. And I want to sort of put that in the room before we start. The presentation is entitled Connecting the Dots, Water Shutoffs, Pensions, Emergency Management, Bankruptcy and Bond. And I'll try to help you think how all these things are going to be connecting together before the end of the presentation. But I want to start out with a spelling lesson, right? And the spelling lesson really is, how do you spell pension? And I think we can take a lesson from Aretha Franklin that we should be spelling pensions, R-E-S-P-E-C-T.
Come on.
And we should be treating this with a whole lot more respect for the contributions that people in this room have made. How many people are pensioners? Right? I'm sure most. All right, all these in there. I think you all deserve a round of applause for the work that you've done for the city, the work you continue to do for the struggle here. I wish I could come with better news, right? These are tough times and there's no easy answer to this. And so I don't make false promises, right? There's no magic bullet that I can tell you that's going to save your pension, are going to reverse this process, or are going to make a lot of things better. These are tough times. What I can try to do is let you know, in some respects, you're not alone, right? But it's not great company. A lot of people are being disadvantaged through this process. A lot of people are being marginalized. A lot of people are being neglected. I hope by the end of the presentation I can help you understand how what's happening to you in the pension system is related to a whole lot of other things happening in the system, and that's the connecting the dots framework. And the notion is if you can understand the common nature of our struggles, we have the potential to start trying to get better coalitions of people who are suffering similar, if not identical, problems that are all based upon larger structures as they're mapping out in terms of fiscal austerity, in terms of sort of very conservative neoliberal policies, and largely, especially in a city like Detroit, in terms of structural racism. And we want to see how, particularly today, there's been an increased conflation in this notion of racism, structural racism, and anti-government sentiment. Right? And if you don't know the nature of the struggle, it's very hard to think strategically about what you're going to do. Right? And these are different waters. Right? Some of these struggles we've gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years, different components of this are being put together in ways that are new, and that if we're going to think strategically how to be responding to that, we've got to understand what's going on. All right, so there's my faceless friend. Right? The whole point here is from kids and with your grandkids and children, you can have all sorts of dots. Right? And if you look at them in isolation, there's no pattern. Right? The notion of connecting the dots is try to bring these things together in a way that we start to see patterns, right? In a way that we start to see that things that otherwise look different are actually quite the same. And this is what I call an issue cluster, right? And I apologize to those in the back that can't see it, so I'll sort of talk a lot, so even if you just close your eyes and didn't see the projector, you're still going to get the same information. In the center of the issue cluster is the logic, right? Every system has a logic, right? And the logic then dictates the behavior and the actions. The logic in this issue cluster and connecting the dots is this convergence of structural racism and fiscal austerity, right? And I'll talk about what those words mean as we go through, and we'll have a lot of repetition, but that's the logic. And then the manifestation of that logic are all of these different dots, oftentimes viewed in isolation, but properly understood are all manifestations of outcomes or symptoms of this convergence of structural racism and fiscal austerity mapped onto issues that are affecting the city of Detroit. So you can think about emergency management, right? We'll talk about that as a manifestation of this logic. You can think about Detroit Future City, and we'll talk about that as a manifestation of this logic. You can think about the Black Light Task Force report that was issued about a year ago. You can think about the water shutoffs, and there was discussions about the Great Lakes Water Authority. You can think about the bankruptcy. You can think about the fate of the pensioners, you in this room, all as manifestations of a similar logic. Right? As a similar problem, right, manifestations of the same logic, then all these people out there thinking that they're in isolation in their own struggle. Right? And that's the hope. If we have a better analysis of what's going on, we might have a better understanding about how to build coalitions and act strategically. So again, I always teach with a lot of repetition. Right? So you're going to get the same things over and over, but hopefully it's going to build the understanding as we're going through. If I were to diagnose Detroit's problems, right, fiscally, politically, socially, it's really the convergence of that logic structure of structural racism and fiscal austerity. And you can trace racism back in Detroit 100 years, 150 years, 200 years. You can trace it back in this country to its origin. Right? So these are long-standing problems that have manifestations that reproduce themselves in each generation over time. Right? Fiscal austerity is a different phenomenon. Right? And probably most politically, you would associate that with the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. Right? And the policies coming with Ronald Reagan and the sort of notion of fiscal austerity. And the truth is, until we had President Obama, and even that's sort of contestable, every president since Reagan has been a Reaganite. Right? So we've had almost 7 administrations in a row furthering these policies of fiscal austerity. You layer that over to the structural racism, you start to have some pretty toxic implications for cities and for social problems. All right? And more problematically, in a more recent setting, probably going back no more than sort of 10 years, there's been a very serious conflation of anti-government sentiment, which is characteristic of fiscal austerity, with racist sentiments. Right? And we've actually racialized the opposition to government, right? Which makes the struggle in order to get government to be more proactive and engaged, right? And doing what we expect government to do for citizens even more complicated today than it would have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, right? And that's that kind of notion of what we'll ultimately call dog whistle politics, and we'll explain again that as we're going through the presentation. All right, so again, this question we see all the time: why is Detroit often in worse shape than other cities, right? Racism doesn't just affect Detroit, right? Structural or fiscal austerity doesn't affect Detroit. So why are things here oftentimes even worse than other parts of the country? And my claim is that you think about cities as living organisms, right? And fiscal austerity puts stress on all organisms. But for some reason, and I don't have a good explanation for it, the depth of racism in Southeast Michigan seems to be more virulent than almost any place else in the country, right? And racism is a pathology, right? So if an organism is infected with a pathology and is placed under stress, right, you expect worse adaptation over time, right? And so the way I think about it is you have all cities being under stress, all of these problems happening, but the virulent nature of racism in Southeast Michigan has led to a maladaptation for the entire region that makes the problems that we have here even significantly worse than other cities that are facing similar stresses. Right? And again, we've got to think about the way that racism and fiscal austerity interact to produce the problems that we're witnessing in the headlines and that are affecting the pensions and your livelihoods and your ability to plan for the future. All right. How does change happen? All right? I want to introduce a fairly simple idea about how to think about change over time. We've got to think separately about belief systems and about institutions. Right? And then we've got to think about how beliefs influence institutions, right? And then how institutions influence beliefs. And it's only if we're thinking about those two things in a process of co-evolution that we start to understand the nature of the problems, how they manifested, but also strategically how we can try to have a greater impact in changing policies, beliefs, institutions, laws in the future. So the belief system we've already started to mention, right? Neoliberalism, fiscal austerity is a belief system, and we'll outline what are the parts of that belief system. Racism, white supremacy is a belief system, right? We want to think about how that works as a belief system. Institutions are really the laws, norms, and regulations that control behavior in society, right? And then we want to think about how the interaction between the two. If I change an institution and don't change a belief system, do I get change? No. Right? You want to know one of the best examples of that is Brown v. Board of Education. Changed the legal rule, didn't change the underlying racist beliefs, and today's schools in the North and the South, and perhaps even more in the North, are more segregated, right, and often in worse shape than they were before the 1954 opinion in Brown v. Board. Right? Because it changed the law, didn't change the institution. If I'm not working both sides of that street, I'm not going to have a chance for long-term change. So again, I want to dive into those different boxes. Right? Again, the whole notion is repetition and kind of putting things in different perspectives starts to deepen our intuition and understanding. So what about these belief systems? Think about worldviews, right? Think about mythology, right? A belief system is our effort to try to make sense of the world, right? A functioning belief system produces order and produces meaning, right? And then we can think about how different things function as belief systems. Economics functions as a belief system. Right, functions largely, in many respects, more as a mythology than it does as social science. Right? Structural racism, white supremacy, functions as a belief system. The Protestant work ethic, right? You start to think about all these things. You want to know the best place to find mythology in America? Your high school history book. Right? And it's true. I mean, sort of go back and think about these things, and that's the function of mythology in order to inculcate values and belief systems in the young to influence how they act as adults. Right? And we've got to be more understanding about how that functions. Right? And then we turn over to institutions. Institutions, that's where the power is. Right? When you think about in economics, it's all about allocating scarce resources. We can think about the rules of the game and the players of the game. We can think about distribution of social benefits and burdens. Right? And then again, it's that interaction that we're ultimately worried about between beliefs and institutions. So again, diving deeper. So I use words, and some of these are words people may not be familiar with. Neoliberalism, fiscal austerity. Right? What does that mean as a belief system? Well, and again, when you start hearing these things, you start to see them in Republican platforms. Right? You start to see them in headlines. You start to hear them in political speeches. There's a very strong belief in markets. Markets work. Markets are efficient. We can trust markets. Right? there's a corresponding fear of the state. Right? What did Ronald Reagan say? The worst thing that can happen is you hear a knock on the door and they say, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. Right? Belief system, mythology, trust markets don't trust the state. That's part of the belief system. Emphasis on private property. Right? Our whole structure is around preserving and protecting private property, unless you live in Detroit. Right? And we can talk about again where these things are violated in the breach. Hypersense of individualism. The entire focus on the individual. We marginalize any social context. Right? Remember the backlash that President Obama said when he said, well, those roads to your factory were built by public taxes, right? And so the goods come in on public roads, they go out through ports that are publicly subsidized, and that whole thing came back, I built this, right? Not that a social context is necessary to provide public goods, but rather that the individual in isolation is the focus, and that's part of this mythology, this belief system. Every belief system has defense mechanisms, right? And so one defense mechanism is to blame and punish people that don't succeed on this false view of meritocracy, right? So if you don't succeed, it's your own dang fault, right? So I have a blame notion. I have a self-defense mechanism in order to say, well, if everybody doesn't succeed, it's your own fault, right? We don't look at social context. We don't try to understand where people are coming from. We blame the individuals. And we create this myth of colorblindness, right? And the way to understand colorblindness, and you see it throughout contemporary Supreme Court opinions, it's no longer, as of about 50 years ago, okay to talk about white supremacy. Sadly, if you go back 50 years ago in the congressional record, you still find people advocating white supremacy. Right? The lineage of white supremacy is now represented in colorblindness. Right? And if you don't make that association between this false notion of colorblindness as the modern-day descendant in the legacy of white supremacy, you don't understand the danger of the rhetoric and the policy facilitating colorblindness. Right? So again, and then colorblindness functions as its own worldviews that can be deconstructed and understood. Right? And throughout this process, there's a vilification of public goods, there's a vilification of government, there's a vilification of public processes. So that's the beliefs. Right? So it's no big surprise when we go over and say, well, what's the institutional systems associated with that? We have a minimal state, right? We have unrestrained private markets. We have advocacy for the privatization of public assets. We have minimal public workers and benefits, right? We have minimal respect. Remember how we're spelling pensions tonight. We have minimal respect for public workers and public pensioners, right? And we have minimal social safety net. And there is a very tight correspondence between the beliefs and the institutions. Right? And that is what I said was half of that logic for the last 40 years has really reshaped our understanding of what government is and increasingly is not in our society. All right, I want to talk a little bit now about structural racism. So we have that on the table as well as one of the governing logics. We need, probably not people in this room who are probably sophisticated, but America needs a far more sophisticated understanding of the role of racism in contemporary society. Right? If you talk about racism, most people are going to say, well, that's intentional discrimination. And that's the top part of this pyramid here. Right? Still exists, still must be vigilant against, still must be fought. Right? So I'm not saying it doesn't exist. But if I view that's the only nature of discrimination or racism, I'm only looking at the tip of the iceberg. Right? There's other forms of racism. And a lot of this is coming out of the work of John Powell. I don't know how many people know John, right? So John's a Detroit native, right? Still loves the city, directs the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society out at Berkeley. And I'll show you a slide of one of his books later, so if you want to sort of think about getting deeper into this from John's work, places where you can go and look at it. But what John makes sure that people understand is that it's structuralized racialization and that it's a verb, right? Racism is not a noun. Racism doesn't exist, right, in the abstract. Racism is what we do to each other, right? It's a verb, it's an action. And I go down in these other parts of this triangle, I have the lower part, which is all this notion of implicit bias. And there's been a lot of interesting work in cognitive psychology that starts to try to better understand the way that the brain works and the way that the sort of racialized categories get formed and get perpetuated. And it starts to demonstrate it's not only the conscious mind, there's all sorts of cultural scripts, there's all sorts of unconscious components, and that often controls behavior, right? And if I'm not dealing with those dynamics interpersonally, in my family, in my workplace, right, in my organization, if I'm not dealing with that socially and politically, I'm not using the best tools and information and strategies that we have, right? But look also what it does. The only discrimination the Supreme Court will recognize is intentional discrimination, right? But if I realize the teachings of implicit bias, intent is no longer a stable category, right? So it also provides a very persuasive and strong critique of modern law to say if I'm only focusing on intent for racism, right, I'm missing all of this and I'm not capturing the real sort of depth of the harm or the pathology, right? And then I go to the last part of the sort of triangle component in the lower square, and that's the structural racism, right? And the best way to get an intuition on structural racism is think about all the data I can dump on this table that show racially disparate outcomes. Disparate outcomes in health, right? It kills, right? The life expectancy of African Americans is significantly lower. Level of heart disease, level of diabetes, right? So health disparities. Outcomes in high school and education, right? Disparities in economic opportunity. How does that exist, right? The study of structural racism is saying, how do the interinstitutional dynamics, right? And that's a fancy law professor saying, how does our social structure produce racial disparity, right? And how does that get perpetuated one generation to the next generation to the next generation? And the study of structural racism is an attempt to try to understand those structural dynamics at a social level that continually produce and reproduce racially disparate outcomes, right? And it's only if we understand the intent, the implicit bias, the structural racism, that we start to have a sufficient set of theories to diagnose and try to guide us strategically about the depth and the implications of racism in our society, right? But every system, as I said before, has to have a logic. And when I teach this to my students, I do it in 2 slides, and the first slide puts that center triangle in just question marks, right? If you're an engineer in, say, hydraulics, right, you've got to understand what moves the system, right? And the truth is, historically in America, it is white supremacy and white privilege that moves this entire system, right? It's not accidental, it's not random, right? And if you don't appreciate that and raise that up and make that conscious and the subject of debate and assessment, you're not going to make progress in trying to get rid of the implications and legacy of the structural racism, right? So it's based upon that logic. Again, the slide here is just to sort of start to introduce this notion that we need far more sophisticated understandings of the effects of race and racism in society. And then we got to think, as we're doing this talk, how does that overlay with fiscal austerity? And then ultimately, how does that impact the policies that are facing Detroit? Right? So that's sort of the bigger agenda that's afoot. All right. You can map things, right? So what I want to do now is go through a short exercise where we think about opportunity, right? What does opportunity mean? How would I measure opportunity? And once I measure it, how do I map it out through Southeast Michigan? Right? And again, this is work coming out of the Kirwan Institute that John Powell used to run before he left for Berkeley. Still a great institute, still doing good work, commissioned by the Michigan Roundtable. So I'm going to show you 2 maps that are coming from that setting. So what is opportunity? Quality of housing, quality of employment, quality of schools, access to health care, quality of transportation, food security, quality of the living environment, right? You want to know the best people who can tell you of where opportunity lies? Real estate agents, right? And they'll steer you around and talk about all the opportunity, the absence of opportunity, right? And that it implicitly probably gets measured in the housing crisis, right? But think about, you all know Southeast Michigan, right? Think about Southeast Michigan, right? Think about it in terms of the presence or absence of opportunity, right? And in your own mind, start to create a map, right? And then paint in the colors of that map. And where you think about hires of opportunity, this is a whole region, right? So think about Oakland County, think about Macomb County, think about Washtenaw, think about Monroe, right? Areas of high opportunity, start painting in your own mind in terms of dark, rich colors, right? Hires of opportunity. Then think about where areas of low opportunity are, right? And then paint that into your map in sort of pale, light colors. Right? And then areas in between sort of get something in between in terms of colors. Right? Then imagine you're in the space station, and you're looking down at Southeast Michigan, and all you can see is the presence or absence of opportunity. Right? So the map I'm going to show next, and it's an ugly SEMCOG map, so I apologize. You get ready for the shock. is a map of Southeast Michigan solely in terms of opportunity. And this is what it looks like. Right? You see this light area sort of up and to the left? Right? That has a name. What do you think that light area's name is? Pontiac. Right? Got to situate. You got to see. That's why I'm sort of starting there. Right? So I start with Pontiac, which can be seen from outer space as an area of low opportunity, and then I move down to this lower right part, right? Also in light pale colors. That has a name. And what's the name of that area? Detroit. Right? So from outer space, right? Aliens could see the absence of opportunity. Right? We have the complete segregation of wealth and opportunity geographically spread. Right? And we got to understand that. That's got to be part of our politics. That's got to be part of our regional and state consciousness. Right? Now, again, what I said, anything that can be measured can be mapped. So I can do the same thing with demography. Right? And the data here is going to be a simplified story of black and white. Right? And I apologize that other communities are not represented, but for teaching purposes, you're going to get the point. Now imagine layering over the presence of the African American population in the region with this map of opportunity. Right? And the dots will be represented in green. That's the African American population in Southeast Michigan. And I'm going to toggle back and forth. Right? You sort of see again the very tight correlation. So we're not just segregating wealth and opportunity, we have segregated race, wealth, and opportunity. Right? And John Powell and others have a name for that. And again, we've got to call things by their true names. The name for that is spatial racism. Right? Spatial racism. Yeah. Yeah. So spatial, right? Space, right? And racism. Right? And do you think that happens accidentally? No. And this is why I want to start putting, again, our own dots together. Think about the belief in the institutions. Think about coevolution of beliefs and institutions over time. Think about the historical, social, political processes that necessarily led to spatial racism. Right? And we can put it in context. Right? And I think, and as I challenge everybody here, I challenge everybody in the state to do, go through the mental exercise where you move in this coevolution of belief in institutions, right, from slavery into Jim Crow segregation in the South, right? And I think even most white people could do that, right? But that's not enough, right? You've got to take the next part of the journey, and the next part of the journey is to move from Jim Crow segregation in the South to spatial racism as represented in those two maps that I showed. Right? And we see far more continuity, right, than disruption. And what we see is the social reproduction over time of racialized systems of oppression. Right? And then again, we've got to say, what does that mean for the problems that are facing Detroit? Right? But I will tell you, if you don't have that map and that concept and have it present in every social, political, economic discussion of anything affecting the region, you are already starting from a false analysis, right? And I say that as an economist. So you have to raise that up, right? We have to make people conscious of that. And they are consciously denying it. I'll talk about that as we look at some of the other reports in the political discourse that's here. This is nowhere to be found in Detroit Future City. This is nowhere to be found in the Bankruptcy Plan of Adjustment. This is nowhere to be found in the Blight Removal Task Force report. This is nowhere to be found in the headlines of the Detroit News or the Detroit Free Press. Right? They're suppressing this. Right? But how can you suppress it? Because we drive through it every day. It's like the glaciers that shape the mountains that shape the country. Right? The social glaciers of racism and fiscal austerity have shaped the geography of Southeast Michigan in a way that you have to consciously deny. Right? It doesn't take a whole lot of thought or data to start bringing these things out. So how does the state respond to this? Right? That should be, and again I'm sort of toggling back and forth a bit, this should be a national crisis, perceived as a national crisis. Right? And yet, rather than responding to this as a crisis, right? I'm going to show you the map or the graph of state revenue sharing from 2000 to 2012. Right? So rather than responding to the increasing distress of falling property markets, right, of decreasing revenue, of the increasing segregation of wealth, of the unsustainability of the tax base, right, the state progressively reduces the amount of money it's providing in revenue sharing, right? The state from 2002 to 2012 has systematically decreased the amount of state revenue sharing which is going to cities, such as Detroit, to provide the basic services that a city needs, right? And again, what's that? Well, I just say, try to write context, all right? And I'll have questions later. I'm happy to sort of have questions, shouted out too. I think it provides more interactivity, and that's important for any education. But again, it shows disconnect, right? At a time where we should have a financial emergency is the predicate of an emergency manager, right? But if you have a financial emergency and you're not providing resources, right, it's like declaring a fire and not bringing water. That's right? And until we start to draw these connections in a very logical sense, we're not going to have sound policy. So this is the game now, right? Back to connecting dots. Each dot can be viewed as its own artifact, right? So we can view them separate, we can view them in concert. I want to think about the dot of emergency management. I want to think about the dot of the Detroit Public Schools. I want to think about the dot of the Detroit Future City Report. I want to think about the dot of the Great Lakes Water Authority, right, or the water shutoffs. We could add tax foreclosures to this. I want to think about the dot of the bankruptcy plan of adjustment, right, that led to the cut in the pensions. So think about those as dots. Then think about each one of those embedded in it has its own belief system and own institutional matrix. Right? So again, we're trying to decrease our ability to analyze these things and to show connections. And like, a magnet, right? We have to start having the increased ability as citizens and advocates to see things that most people don't see, right? To see interconnections, right? To see the effects of these things on policy. And there's a great analogy for that, right? We all did it as kids. All right, we put the iron pilings on a piece of paper, we put the magnet under the iron, and we saw the magnetic fields produced. So the goal here is to do the same thing and see the effects of racism, see the effects of fiscal austerity, see the effects of worldviews, see the implications on institutions, right? And try to start making these things more manifest, more apparent, purposely, so then we can act more strategically as citizens and politicians and advocates and engaged social actors to try to get better outcomes. Right? Sure. So this notion of connecting the dots. And you'll realize that those are the same dots that were in the picture before, largely, which had it all in a circle. And we'll have a chance to talk briefly about these different dots as we're going forward in the presentation. All right, so we've got our invisible forces. Then we start applying the theory to the particular dots, the particular issues. Right? We're told that there's a financial emergency. Right? Well, there's a big difference, everybody knows, trying to balance their checkbook between debt and cash flow. Right? And bankruptcy is not a problem of debt. Right? Bankruptcy is a problem of cash flow. Right? If bankruptcy were just debt, think about America. Right? And if it's cash flow instead, cash flow can be manipulated. Right? Cash flow is something that can be viewed as opportunistic. Right? A shortage of cash. Cash flow problems can also be solved with different kinds of aid and assistance to get people over hard times. Right? So it's not inevitable that a point of bankruptcy arises. Right? And we got to sort of think about these things as more contestable. And it's particular, maybe it is inevitable if I start decreasing the revenue sharing over a period of time, that a cash flow crisis would be inevitable. But the policy option of bankruptcy is not the only response. Right? The logical response to there is to think about how do I provide more resources. And then we think more particularly about the three most important sets of resources for most cities. Right? State revenue sharing, we already showed the graph of what's happening with state revenue sharing. Right? Property taxes. Right? And then think about we had the collapse of the real estate market. The real estate prices in Detroit have been falling for a long time. Right? And that has huge implications for then property tax revenue. Right? And so as a tax revenue, and again, right, this is all should be viewed from a regional perspective. At the Key Center, we have what we call the 3 R's. And we try to advocate that any issue affecting Detroit should be viewed from the 3 R's. And it's not reading, writing, and arithmetic. Right? It's race, regionalism, and reconciliation. Right? And if you're not looking at it from those three perspectives, so from a regional perspective, the collapse of the housing market in Detroit from a 70-year standpoint is no big, mystery. Right? It's a product of white flight. It's a product of regional segregation. It is a product of the forces that produce the spatial racism we were talking about earlier. Right? And to look at the bankruptcy and not acknowledge that, right, is a false narrative. Right? It's creating a false frame for analysis. So anyway, falling state revenue sharing, falling property taxes, and increased legacy costs. Right? And those are serious things. Healthcare and pensions are difficult things that need to be managed. I'm not trying to minimize that. But you can start to see again that it's a far more complicated and contested picture than most of the media frame presents. Right? Moreover, and this is again part of that psychological defense mechanism, who gets blamed for the bankruptcy? Detroit. Yes. Right? Detroiters, right? And Detroit's citizens and public officials. Right? None of that blame gets to be sort of dispersed to other places. It doesn't go to Lansing. It's responsible for revenue sharing. The second part of the slide talks about all of the financialization that's taking place. None of that blame went to Wall Street. Right? Mm-hmm. The sort of notion of the cops and the swaps and the city finances, despite the fact that the refinancing of bonds for the water department is increased costs far more than any decrease in revenue from residents not paying their bills. Right? But those lines don't get questioned, right? Because markets work. Markets are efficient, right? It's only the government that is bad. And we're seeing, again, how the worldview, the ideology, starts to influence the narrative, the frame, and therefore the range of policy options that are viewed as actionable or even conceivable, right? And so if we're not then advocating for new worldviews, new belief systems, we're not going to have the space to advocate for new institutions, new policies, new practices. And then the Wall Street responsibility for the private mortgage foreclosure crisis in Detroit goes again directly to the large banks, right? And that increased. All right, so we go from financial crisis to emergency management. What is an emergency manager? An emergency manager is a state-imposed anti-democratic regime. Right? And that's not hyperbole.
Anti-democratic.
Right? That's not hyperbole. Right? That's what you'd find if you look in Webster's. Right? That's just factually what it is. State-imposed anti-democratic regime. Right? Displaces democracy. But more importantly, what is the institutional policies that are associated with emergency management? And we're seeing again that neoliberal, that fiscal austerity, that Ronald Reagan coming forward is the policy template that the declaration of a financial emergency brings up. Right? And what is that? And again, we're seeing the repetition here. We're seeing the dots connect. We're seeing the microcosm of the worldview and the institutional matrix inside each one of these. Shrink the size of government, privatize public assets, cancel labor contracts and reduce the public workforce, and take the city into bankruptcy. Right? And we start to see a tight one-to-one correspondence between the belief system of fiscal austerity. We see the connection between the spatial racism and the existence of a financial crisis and distress in the city. And then we have a ready-made solution, right, under the guise of emergency management that is implementing the institutional policies that are associated with fiscal austerity. Again, each one of these is telling the same story but from a different vantage point. Think about the Detroit public schools. You have a structurally deficient school finance system at the state level, right? This is state-driven, right? Complicated then by an increase in charter schools and interdistrict schools of choice, right? Which produces a financial crisis, which brings in an emergency manager. The emergency managers can't solve the problem any better than a democracy because it's a structural problem, right? It's not a policy problem. And the challenge, I actually feel sorry for the emergency manager in the schools because their goal is to cut the costs faster than the revenues fall. I'll say that again. I got to cut my costs faster than my revenues fall. And anybody has any appreciation of fixed costs, that's just an impossible task. This cannot be done, right? Which again, if you're not changing the finance formula, if you're not changing the structure of the institutions supporting the school system, you cannot solve the school problem, right? And yet again, who gets blamed? Detroiters, the Detroit School Board, right? And again, we have a state-imposed anti-democratic solution, right? For what is here, even more clearly than the financial crisis, a state-created crisis, right? And again, the blame mechanisms come in, right? We don't see those connections, we don't see those things. We then blame the victims, right? And say that they're not responsible and they can't have democracy, right? And if anybody isn't insulted by that, your brain's not working. All right. Next dot, Detroit Future City. All right. This is now the effort to plan the future of Detroit for the next 50 years. They use distressed property markets as the template. Right? They then consciously disinvest in areas that are distressed as the mechanism of change. And they yield a view of the city in the future where huge areas are going to be depopulated and put to alternative uses. Right? And again, we can think about the 3 R's. Right? So this is from the Detroit Future City report. This is a map. Right? What's that map of? Right? What do we not see on this map? Anything else. Right? Almost every map in that report, which is nearly 400 pages, views Detroit in isolation. Right? We don't see Macomb. We don't see Oakland. We don't see Grosse Pointe in Wayne County. We don't see Downriver. We don't see Dearborn. Right? And if I go back to that map of spatial racism, right, I have an opportunity desert now as the frame of action, not a region, right, which is opportunity rich. Right? And as we tell the law students, if I control the frame, I control the outcome. So if the frame is an opportunity desert, the logic is social triage. Right? Hard decisions, we're sorry, tough times, right? Not this effort of having an emergency and bringing resources to the table. Not an effort of seeing the regional injustice, right, that is producing the financial distress and then getting at the roots of race, regionalism, and seeking reconciliation as a long-term strategy of mutual support and mutual growth, right? I now have, again, a concentrated punish the victim prescription that's not just for the last 50 years, which is going to guarantee that's carried forward for the next 50 years, right? So in these colors, the kind of pinkish areas to make it the most extreme are the least occupied in terms of housing markets. The turquoise-ish sort of bluish-gray colors are the most occupied. And then I'm going to overlay investment in city services. And what we're seeing is that the areas that are already, quote-unquote, viable are going to get more resources. It's like reverse Robin Hood, right? The areas that are most distressed are targeted, right? Targeted for less resources. In a future where those pink areas now are turquoise and blue, are going to be blue and green infrastructure without people living there. Right? Without people.
Go back to the last slide.
All right, so I'll do that quickly. That's the property markets, right? Where, again, sort of imagine, everybody knows the city, right? So imagine where you live, right, on this map, right? The pink areas or the purplish areas are the most highest vacancy rates, right? Most distressed, right? The turquoise ones are the most occupied. Then I overlay the notion of investment in city services, right? Your lighting, your sewer, your police, your fire, your garbage, right? And I have a concentrated effort to target city resources disproportionately to the more viable, higher occupancy areas, and to decrease it. Social triage, right? This is a triage decision.
So on this right here, the purple stands for what?
The dark purple is the industrial backbone, and that's targeted for higher investment. The darker colors down in the downtown area means that's one of the few areas that's going to see increased investment in city services. The darker colors in the kind of lighter bluish or turquoise areas are going to be areas that are going to get reinvestment in city services. The peach colors are areas that are going to be relatively disinvested in city services, right? It's the same map, right? So the same template is now going to say allocating more resources to the areas that are highest occupied and quote-unquote most viable, take resources away from the areas that are most distressed, right? That's, remember, you need the logic, you need the hydraulics, you need the levers. That's one of the levers that's producing the change. The change ultimately is going to be no residential use in those purplish areas in the first color that were the ones demonstrating the lowest level of occupancy, right? So areas where people live now, right, are envisioned not to be areas where people live 30, 40, 50 years from now, right? Well, how do we get there? Well, we'll talk about that with some connecting some dots later. One area, arguably, right, if people are living in places you don't want them to be, turn their water off. Right? You can live longer without food than without water. And I think if you start thinking about the water shutoffs, first there's this notion of privatization. There's that blame thing about paying bills. You see the psychological defense. You see the outplay of the belief systems. You see the application of the institutional matrices which tell me which policies I then adopt, which is to sort of hold people accountable and shut off water. But if I overlay Detroit Future City on this, I at least have a serious concern that a logic of depopulation is also part of the logic of the water shutoffs. Right? The people are living in places we don't want them to be living in. We now, the collective Detroit Future City and other powers that be. And the way to get that there, amongst other things, right, is shutting water off. Right? I think you can tell a similar story with the tax foreclosures. Right? Which are going to say people are living there and we're going to use the tax foreclosures to get them out of the way. Right? And this water assistance, we were talking earlier about affordability versus assistance. The work that Kurt Guyette has done has shown that this assistance is just completely a fiction. Right? That almost everybody enrolled in the assistance program has fallen off. Right? Tell me how good of an assistance program that is. Right? But again, if I wanted to move to affordability, what does that entail? New beliefs that are explaining why affordability is a legitimate concept, why equity, why progressive taxation is an appropriate concept, why community has to be the foundation of a rate structure, why sustainability matters, why keeping people in place matters, right? New belief systems mapped onto new institutional space. Right? So again, we're sort of seeing as we pivot from where we're at now to where we might want to go in the future, we have to use the same framework but start to change it in ways that are more advantageous to the people that are long-term residents of the city of Detroit. All right, so again, I'm not going to dwell on this, but Blight Task Force report. What did Dan Gilbert say we should do? Knock all the houses down as quick as we can, right? And then create a land bank that will suck them all up, right? All the properties out there that are being sucked up, and then aggregate them and spit them out to new uses, right? So you have to start connecting those dots. The three most important documents that show you at least the intellectual framework, whether it can be implemented or not is anybody's guess. Detroit Future City, Blight Task Force report, Bankruptcy Plan of Adjustment gives you a tight sort of triad of documents to say, flip property from private to public, right? Aggregate it in the form of the land bank, right? Spit it out to new uses. The new uses should conform with the template that I established with the Detroit Future City report, right? Connecting dots. Bankruptcy Plan of Adjustment, right? This is perfectly built to establish the minimal state, right? And what is the minimal state? That is the core of the fiscal austerity, the neoliberalism, right? So it's a mechanism to enshrine this minimal state. And then if I wanted to sort of talk about connecting dots again, it introduced, and this doesn't ultimately make it through, but again, I talk about planning as a vehicle to demonstrate intent. They wanted to engage in exit financing to support the Blight Task Force report, right? So after we retired all the debt, after we cut the pensions, they wanted to take out new debt, right? And how would they use the new debt? Not to invest in schools, not to create opportunity for people, but to enforce or to finance a large portion of Dan Gilbert's Blight Removal Task Force report. Right? And again, there's a big difference. So another sort of mantra we have at the center, existing development theories are property-centered development. Right? The alternative approach is a people-centered development. And we have to flip from the existing system of property-centered development to a system of people-centered development if we're looking for alternative belief systems and alternative institutional structures. All right. And that's sort of reflected in using that same framework we have. Right? We're seriously the circle being closed a little bit. We need new beliefs. Right? We need beliefs that will be centered in an understanding of race, right? And structural racism and history and context. We need one that is striving aspirationally, and that may be a multi-general process, in my own mind towards regional reconciliation, right? Redefining what community is as part of this belief structure, redefining who our neighbor is as part of this belief structure, not viewing people in isolation of social context, right? But we have to consciously think about cultivating this belief. What are our beliefs? What are the values, right? How do we articulate them? How do we create them to be persuasive and as multi-layered as the belief systems that are now removing those rights and those benefits? And then how does that fit in strategically with new rules, new laws, new norms, new regulations, new policy alternatives? And we can create a new issue cluster, right? Again, the logic is at the center. The logic here is an equitable, people-focused development, right? Putting people at the center of development, not property at the center of development. And then I can look at the issues. Many of these are happening already if we connect these dots in a new way. The community benefits ordinance and the organizing that's done around community benefits is highly consistent with this and is galvanizing of this in a way that can be catalytic. Right? Community land trust is an alternative basis for land holding and land formation. The water affordability plan fits completely within this construct, right? And building upon the work that you're doing with the petition survey or drive to get water affordability. Safe schools, right? Respect for public employment, pathways to opportunity. Right? We have to start mapping out an alternative set of development and belief systems. All right? And I've got about four more slides that are now thinking about the national politics. All right? So we're focusing about the implications of Detroit. I'm not Pollyannish, right? Moving to alternative beliefs and institutions is going to be hard. Right? But I actually think that people in Detroit have a unique ability to pioneer the effort. Right? But nationally, right, we have huge obstacles. So the effort now in the next couple of slides is to try to show how nationally the obstacles are going to be against us and things that we need to be conscious of. So again, new beliefs. We need a future with a new ethos to support public action, right, and to fight racism. Right? And those are probably the two most important things we can do for this generation and the next generation. Defend why government is good and the role of government and the importance of government. And derivative of that is the public employees and support of the public employees, right? And the hard work that you've committed over your entire careers, right? Provide an affirmative case for government at the same time we're fighting for racial equality.
That's right.
Right? And those two are the same fight, increasingly the same fight. But it's going to be tough. And this is again where I'm trying to show some other resources to people. The book on one side is Racing to Justice, and that's John Powell's new book. So if you want, again, that sort of notion of structural racism, how it gets applied, discussions of spatial racism, that's a great resource. Right? And then the other book is a wonderful book, came out last year, called Dog Whistle Politics. Right? And it's eye-opening. Right? And these are smart people. I'm just going to sort of report what they say. I don't take any credit for this. I just learned from other people. But it's scary at a national level. So let's think quickly through sort of the history of the last 80, 100 years, right? And think about two dimensions. Is it pro-government or anti-government, right? Is it pro-civil rights or anti-civil rights, right? If you go to the New Deal, right, very strong pro-government ethos, right? Government could help. Government did help. Government did provide assistance, right? But the dirty little secret that we don't learn in our history books is that the New Deal was highly racialized. Right? The entire New Deal was anti-civil rights. Right? Consciously structured to systematically deny access to these benefits, predominantly for the African American community. Right? So we had pro-government, right? Anti-civil rights. Right? We then have a civil rights movement, right? Starting to push that agenda and looking for racial equality, fighting racism, right? With very good success. Right, in the realms where we had action. Then you have the Great Society. Right? Again, remember our two dimensions, government, civil rights. What was wonderful about the Great Society, it was both pro-government. We're going to extend this into Medicare. Right? We're going to extend it into Medicaid. But it was also an effort to remove the evils of the New Deal and to make those programs racially inclusive. Right? So the Great Society vision was pro-government, right? Pro-civil rights. And then what did that cause? A backlash against civil rights, right? Almost instantaneously. Clearly within a decade of the majority of the civil rights victories was a backlash against civil rights, right? And then what happened was a backlash against government, right? So we have a backlash against civil rights. We then have a backlash of government, starting with sort of Nixon, Reagan, the fiscal austerity you see coming forward, Clinton, Bush II, right? And so what we have now is two things. We have a government ethos that is anti-government and anti-civil rights. Right? And more importantly, and this is what some of the other slides are doing, this is coming out of dog whistle politics, it has contemporaneously been conflated. So government has been racialized. Right? And so it's now not only working to get pro-government, pro-civil rights, it's now a new task to try to address this conflation on the right of government and race. Right? So it creates a new sort of virulence of racism and anti-government that's going to require new strategies to try to change. So that's sort of in a nutshell. If you want a little bit deeper in the history, you want to say, when did the Great Society fall apart and why did it fall apart? You would take 1966 as the time frame. Right? Everybody remembers the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Yes. Public accommodations. Right? Civil Rights Act 1965 was voting rights. Right? Who remembers the Civil Rights Act of 1966? Didn't exist. Yeah, exactly. What was it supposed to be? Housing. Right? So this was the plan. Public accommodations, voting, housing. Right? Housing segregation, spatial racism, is more of a problem of the North than the South. Right? So it was interestingly when the civil rights movement came to the North over the issue of housing in the year of 1966 that you had the collapse of the Civil Rights Coalition and really the collapse of the New Deal. Right? And put a little sort of more context in that. Martin Luther King came to Chicago in the summer of 1966 to fight for housing segregation. And anybody who remembers the video wants to get it on YouTube, more violent than any response he got in the South. Right? Cicero. Now, over housing in the North, the predicates what? Of spatial racism. Right? We're again connecting the dots to that map that we had out earlier. How does that get produced? In the summer was an effort by Johnson to get the Civil Rights Act of 1966 with housing protection and housing desegregation. Right? It led to the collapse of the Civil Rights Coalition, and in the midterm election in November, you saw the very first combining of Northern racism and Southern racism. Right? Your Reagan Democrats of 1966, right, with your Southern Democrats before they all became Republicans. Right? Led to huge losses for the Democrats in the House and the Senate. Right? Put the nails in the coffin of the New Deal. So again, we have the rise of anti-civil rights, right? And the collapse of the New Deal, which was pro-government. Right? And now you add through, follow that sort of backlash against civil rights. Where did it go next? Right? Busing in education. Right? Affirmative action. And where was affirmative action most predominantly in? Public employment. Right? So again, now public employment becomes the enemy. Right? The government becomes the enemy who's trying to interfere with my schools, interfere with my jobs, interfere with my opportunity. And the anti-civil rights sentiment lays the seeds to cultivate a broader backlash against government more broadly. Right? Then think about how that goes on to the sort of fanning the flames of racism more consciously. And this goes into the dogma side. Right? The sort of pivoting of Nixon and Goldwater into law and order, right? Which was really sort of code words against urban violence, right? And unrest. Reagan and his war on crime. We have mass incarceration now as a legacy, right? And this cycle of othering and belonging, creating the other becomes the enemy, that then becomes a catalyst of anti-civil rights, but also an argument against government activism, government policies. All right. So again, increasingly, and think about Reagan again with welfare, right? Starts to racialize welfare, right? Which is a myth, because who are the majority of welfare recipients? White people, right? And yet, when I racialize it, right, with welfare queens and everything else, what am I doing? Right? First, it's false, but belief systems are not true or false, right? Belief systems are myths and operate as mythology. I now start through the welfare to racialize government programs, right? And this is where the psychology, that sort of implicit bias and other things comes relevant. So not only in the popular mind is there opposition of welfare as being for the other, right? Not for us, not for when I'm in trouble, not for people like me. Think about the psychology of white supremacy and now colorblindness on white recipients. Right? What's the emotion that they hold? Self-hatred, right? Which also then gets pivoted into racism. Right? So now I not only turn the non-welfare recipients against the program, the racism now turns the white recipients against themselves and against the programs. It really shows you how insidious racism is. It hurts everybody. Right? And then I extend the racialization of welfare into other government programs, and I had the predicate already with employment and affirmative action and busing and housing. And I now go to the tax code, and I convince all of the poor white people that someday they'll be rich, right? When they're rich someday, they'll want to have low taxes, right? And I start to, again, change the political dynamics. But the difficulty is, and it's something that we have to recognize, is that now it's no longer just either anti-government or anti-civil rights, it's now conflated. And that's a much harder political puzzle to try to circumvent, right? And if you read The Dogmas of Politics, and I recommend it, it puts this next move, which I did not appreciate until I read the book, into place, right? Think about poor President Obama, right? So here he comes along, in 2008, wins the election, right? Which most people would tell is a narrative of racial progress in this country, right? But think about how that gets coded in with this sort of conflation of race and anti-government and anti-civil rights. right? First thing to recognize is that Clinton was a Reaganite, right? Clinton was an accommodationist. He wasn't an oppositional political force, right? And so just don't think we had two democratic regimes in there, that we had opposition, right? And indeed, Clinton told us what? The era of big government is over, right? And gave us harder crime bills and other things than the previous predecessors pushed that agenda, right? And that means we've had 7 administrations, which was longer than the entire New Deal period, establishing this regime of fiscal austerity, right? That's tough to counter. One president's not going to do that, right? So the President Obama gets elected, right? Probably, since Johnson, the first pro-government president in the White House. Government has a role, right? So I go back to my 2 dimensions, government and civil rights, pro-government, right? Substantively and symbolically, as the first black president, pro-civil rights, right? So he's now pushing, right, maybe not as aggressively as some people in the room might like, and myself, an agenda that is going to be more pro-government, government has a role, and an agenda that is for racial equality, right? And then what's his first signature program? Healthcare, which symbolizes that, right? Universal healthcare, at least a process that might lead towards more universal healthcare. Pro-government, consistent with the New Deal ideology, right? Think about if you're now raised for 40, 50 years in this anti-government conflation of race, conflation of big government, right? What do you see now? The first African-American president pushing a pro-government regime. You have become the poster child of the conflated new politics, right? And I think that starts to explain that the virulent, right, opposition to the Tea Party, which now completely conflates the anti-civil rights and the anti-government movement, and now uses our first black president, who's trying to establish a good role for government, as the poster child to be the oppositional force to. Right? That's certainly not all of America, right? But if we're not recognizing that as a very serious new strain of politics that needs to be understood, dissected, and confronted in all of its complexity, and not just dismissed as a bunch of crazy people, right? We don't understand the fight ahead, right? And I think that this type of analysis helps us to start to think about the depth of the Tea Party movement, what we're going to see in the debates tomorrow, right? The forces that give you out of nowhere Donald Trump as an allegedly legitimate national character, right? But also, more importantly, stepping back in history shows us the nature of the real struggle, and that we have to now start very self-consciously putting forward what is the case for government, right? Think about all the good you did in your careers, right? Think about all the help that you did, right? Think about how necessary those services were and still are. We have to defend those now in ways that we never thought we had to.
Yes.
Right? So we have to have a very conscious effort of what is the role of public goods, what's the role of public action, what's our responsibility to each other, what's the nature of our community, and we have to build that case. At the same time, we have to incredibly aggressively be pushing for racial equity. And they're the same thing, right? And we have to recognize how this has been conflated by other political actors, right? And work strategically around that, right? And like judo, oftentimes if you know the nature of the opponent, you can shift it in different directions. And you can use the opposition, use the momentum strategically. But if you don't know the nature of the struggle, right, we're all sitting here frustrated trying to figure out what's happening to us, right? So I wish I could end this talk telling you how to get your pensions back, right? Can't do that, right? But I can tell you you're not alone. That a lot of people are suffering like you are from the same dynamics of structural racism, fiscal austerity, anti-civil rights, anti-government. And if we start to recognize the dynamics of that and see that as a common struggle, you can leave this room recognizing you have new allies, right? They can be the basis of a new coalition that's going to be part of, really, it's going to have to be a multi-generational struggle to try to get decent role for government providing services for people in a way that is consistent with racial equity. So thank you.
If you have a question, why don't you line up in the center aisle and come up to the mic?
So you're in my shoes, you see your presentation, and what do you suggest, like, through advice of what we do, you were in my shoes. And
Yeah,
just saw you.
which is great, because one of the things we're trying to do at the center, and this is professor talk, right? And this is boring, right? And this is distant, right? So one thing that we actually do need, practical thing, I'm meeting with some folks and have other processes, but you'd be welcome to join in. How do you make this real to people? How do you make it understandable to as wide an audience as we can? How do we refine it? So how do you contribute to the analysis, right? How do you improve this? How do you take out what's wrong? How do you make it better? But there is a very important need to translate something like this, right, into something that actually impacts people's lives. So I think, again, strategically in the social movement building, this is my best effort, right? But it's not good enough, right? And it's not going to reach the people that need to hear it. And you have the ability, and other people in this room have the ability to help in a process to say, take what's useful on this, make it better, right? Make it relevant, use spoken word, use other media, get the message out, and that's really something that you can do that I could never do, right? And so again, look at the sort of skill set that we all bring to this. And I would say a very concrete way. If you wanted to work with us and think about how do you take this to members of your community, translate it, make it more accurate, make it relevant, that's going to be far more effective than somebody getting this PowerPoint.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Great.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. Our next meeting is the third Monday at Nandy's at 11 a.m. Also, we're going to be having a fish fry coming up in September. We'd like for you to support that. And if there's nothing else, we are adjourned.